I'll get a badge.
It should be recording now, so you can start whenever you want.
Excellent. Is that okay first if I check in and make sure that people can hear us, see us, everything? All right. Remember those meeting controls went, but
You go, just if you go up over screen share, it should pop down.
oh yeah, there we go. All right. At home, I always do things on like the dual monitor, so
Yeah.
it helps me to actually see what's going on one screen.
Exactly. Two monitors are not a luxury. You guys hear us?
Yeah, can people hear us? Enter into the chat, say something, anything.
Yes, we hear you.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Christy. Excellent. And thanks for joining us, Christy. So for those that are watching on Zoom, thanks for being here. You have Andrea Vickery, myself, you have Liz Schmitt, and you have Grace Maxon-Clark, and we are the hive mind behind this panel. So today, what we've really set up is that we want to make sure that our students and faculty and staff, anyone that's really working in a classroom, realizes how difficult it can be. There are these moments that pop up. You've probably had moments in your past or anticipating different moments. And so we want to talk through some different options using some generic examples that kind of get at the heart of common issues that all of us have encountered. And so we are going to start with this panel where we are going to start first before we get into discussion of any sort of case studies are some frameworks to help us identify how we might behave, our typical communication strategies, and recognize kind of the structural conditions. Then we'll get into the case studies, and then we'll review some campus resources that exist, other resources, and we can really open this up to make it yours. If after we do some examples, you say, hey, I really want to talk about this thing that happened, we're happy to do so. Just make sure you don't give out too many identifying details. And there's a real reason behind us having the three of us, right? We have someone that's junior faculty that may have experienced these sorts of things and not known or maybe not felt as empowered. We have long-term instructor expertise that has encountered everything in a classroom that could ever happen. And then we also have the a student's perspective, which kind of adds in and complements the knowledge of resources and references that exist in our student conduct policy and what happens maybe with the behavioral team after we get there. So hopefully that all sounds good to you. So one thing that we wanted to start with, and this is where I'm just going to ask Liz to kind of chime in too, is from Liz's expertise and our expertise, there's a lot out there that can help you think through what you can do as a faculty member. Right, Liz?
Right. Well, I think the important thing is, there's a history there, and I think we have a history of growing structure, a growing scaffold of student support that really helps them be successful academically by structuring supports outside that academic arena. And it's really changed. So alternatives you might have had in sort of my 10th year here in 2005 are very different than the support structure that now exists in 2026. And so I think it's important for people to know all that's there and who they can consult with. And I think the other thing is, historically, college professors aren't ready to handle classroom management, right? Right. So you usually think, college is optional, and the classroom problems that might plague K through 12 teachers and the tools that they have to handle it aren't something that academics are ever really trained on. So it's not always something that we're ready to handle, right? And it's not always clear where you go for help. And potentially in junior faculty, you might not feel you want to go for help sort of in-house to your department unit because you may not be comfortable signaling that you're having some trouble in the classroom. And so we'll talk about how to get other resources about that as well.
Yeah, and one thing before we get into the case studies, and I know we're sharing some resources that are not necessarily developed by us, but we've looked through them, is recognizing that you as a faculty member have, we all communicate differently. We have different strategies. We have our own classroom management guidelines that might be in our syllabus or common in our department. And one thing that we found really helpful in preparing this that we'd love you to keep in mind when we start discussing case studies are the different strategies that are available. So again, these are communication strategies. It's Up to you how you want to respond, how you have responded in the past. And, these responses might use some kind of typical language, right? If you're going to directly name problematic behavior, right, you have to name that behavior, but the actual calling out of like, hey, doing this is not in line with our, classroom guidance policy from the syllabus, or, oh, that's not appropriate for this discussion, is going to sound somewhat similar in various contexts. So that's something to kind of keep in mind, that, there are some ways that you might even range into staying silent, hoping, praying, sending all that nonverbal energy out to be like, hey, what you're doing is not vibing with our classroom vibe. But you are also going to see that maybe in certain situations, some strategies work better than others, but sometimes some of it really is in the moment, and then there's what you can do after. And so that's what we want to make sure you kind of see, right? When you're thinking about these strategies, when you're thinking about kind of naming behavior, identifying what's going on, you have to think both in the moment and then afterwards think what happens after. So this is something that, we can send out these slides after if you want it, but this is from our colleagues at the University of Michigan. They put together great resources there. And so having that in mind is part of this. So all the case studies that we're going to talk about and what you bring to us too, we hope we'll start first and foremost with that challenge. We have to identify what's happening. What are students doing, right? Is this just like annoying, frustrating behavior? Where does it kind of fall on the scale? And then what can you do in the moment and after the moment to respond and, really acknowledge these challenges? So we have a starting case study for you for us to discuss. This will be where when you can, we'd love to hear you unmute. What we'll do is kind of talk through some options, talk through this framework, of different strategies, identifying the behavior itself. And then as we do that, we'll start to hear from our similar experiences, and then we'll get to loop in Grace. And Grace will kind of get to talk from that Dean of Students perspective and complement what happens in the classroom, because what happens in the classroom often extends beyond the classroom.
In the classroom. It doesn't stay there. It's not Vegas, people. What happens in the classroom doesn't stay there. So we'll start with, we're kind of starting, I think, we're starting with some of the more innocuous cases and then sort of escalating to cases where people think that something is dangerous to either to themselves or to others in the classroom and more serious. And obviously the appropriate responses are going to scale differently. So this one is more kind of maybe about disruption. And disruption that sort of colors the classroom in a negative way in terms of the community experience, right? So in the student A, right, the professor's in front of the entire class out loud, this reading is so stupid and it's wrong, I can't believe that you made us read it, right? And so sort of disruptions to the process of what you hope to do in class that day. And particularly the disruption potentially begins a negative chain, right? Because other students, yeah, I'm stupid, I didn't want to read this, it was stupid or something like that. Or potentially what I've noticed when I've helped colleagues, others, it's other people are really there because they're really into it. So you have someone wound up in a class because they had to, it was at the time slot, it meets a requirement, whatever. But there are others that are really into it, that came very excited about the class, and then this sort of colors it in this negative way, and they find it very discouraging, right? So there's a lot of different reasons this becomes a disruptive force. And really, someone said this once and never again. You're right, you would actually just ignore it that first time. And so this becomes sort of repeated, becomes the vibe, right, to be brought to the class. And so the question is, how do you really handle it, right? And this is particularly, I think, a little more difficult because the students just being disruptive because they were talking about the very bad call again that went against the Bills, right? Which is legit, right? But not in the classroom, right? Not time and place, not good. Legit gripe, absolutely. So this is really, actually, it's about the material too. So you can't even shut it down by saying, this is what we're here to talk about, right? So you really have to talk about the confront. So we think about how would you label this behavior? That's sort of kind of my label of the challenge. And what strategy would you start with? So I guess I'm going to I'll start right with what my strategies would do and how my strategies was evolved, right? So as a younger faculty, and I was in my early faculty days when I was yet to be a parent and not nearly the patient, I would have said tough, right? College is optional. And so I would not have sort of been the developmental case that we may have today. But this would actually be, well, readings aren't just stupid. There's a reason. What is the thesis of the reading and why do you reject it? Right? What are the main points of the reading? Why do you reject it? Or for those who don't, I said, okay, good starting off point. Let's get out a piece of paper. Or if you use iClicker like I do, what do you think is wrong with the reading? And iClicker is great because you can set it up even to be anonymous. So students can actually, they get credit for answering, but you don't know who answered what. So you can do a freestyle one and say, give me a phrase about why, or you can actually, who thinks this reading is sort of wrong or stupid? Who thinks this reading was worthwhile? Who's in the middle? And so you do a straw poll. And you say, okay, tell me why. So tell me stupid, awesome, meh, right, in the middle. So give me your answer and tell me why. And you can like I said, you can set them up anonymously, and now you've started the discussion. And you started the discussion that really focuses them back to the reading, defending their position, and whether or not they've sort of liked the reading or thought it was wrong, they're now confronted. And now you have a teachable moment. And you have a teachable moment that in some senses, I wouldn't say legitimize, but listens to the disruptive student, right? Because now the disruptive student is kind of heard. So I'm not outhand rejecting that something is stupid or wrong, but I am expecting you to back it up in sort of the language and words that we use as young scholars to talk about whether or not this reading was worthwhile or not. And its thesis, whether or not we reject it or accept the thesis of the reading. Anyone else?
Just keeping an eye on the chat.
This is why you want a second monitor.
Mm-hmm. I mean, as people are waiting to chime in, seeing anything.
Not seeing anything. So this one seems fairly innocuous at we start. This becomes a lot more serious if it happens every single class. And so part of this one kind of builds, we found this one, I said, let's keep this example part of it because I dealt with, I would guess say it was last spring. So almost a year ago, I dealt with a faculty member that came for help for someone who was doing this, that every reading was stupid and this was dumb. And it was sort of quashing the vibe of other people that were very excited that really chose that class for a reason. And, she was trying to handle it sort of on her own one-to-one, and then it really happened. The student who was causing the disruption was absent one day for whatever reason. And then some of the students said, I'm glad the student is not here because they ruined the experience for me. And then she kind of realized the whole effect it was having.
Yeah.
And that the students were not compartmentalizing it and doing their own thing. It was affecting their whole experience. And she had to go forward because it was repeated.
And the repeated, I think in there, we do have some thoughts from the chat. So Michael Chenis does add in, right, pausing class. So kind of iClicker or pop quiz, or even just addressing, right, sometimes in there, yes, giving students the chance to speak, right? Oftentimes, they can kind of get to know what happens if they make an offhand comment. And I think that's really getting where we're going. If it's offhand, right, that's one thing, right? You've had it. Sometimes it's that person just really has some thoughts. Maybe it's not even the reading itself. It's like, oh, it was long, or I didn't like the format. You get sometimes when you let them just say, hey, what are you thinking? You get some things. So yeah, you can do quiz. And Pat gets to something that's pretty important that, it starts to paint a different picture, and why we wanted to start with some examples that can be complicated because as Pat mentions, she had a student with LD issues. So when we're thinking about maybe learning development, right? And that acting out is kind of discovering who they like, the acting out for covering it, right? Talking to students individually. And yes, that's one of the things that we wanted to start with is, recognizing that there's a lot that goes into kind of understanding the individual student, right? Sometimes it's them finding their voice, figuring out who they are as students, right? Maybe even distinguishing what is this class about? And there is some of that. But then there's also some continued things that students might do, right? If it's that one-off thing, right, do that quiz, start opening up that conversation. Well, why are we reading, right? Well, sometimes that's even the thing. Why am I asking you to read? But we might see like some continued, right? We see some of those non-verbals.
I'll follow up on Pat's and say, right, so we talked about, we kind of left off, and she's like, this becomes a real problem when it continues. A one-off is pretty well handled. Right? And it becomes a problem when it continues. And sometimes it intersects with issues of accessibility. And, students' right to an appropriate education under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And we're not experts on the law as instructors, but we have experts on this campus who can be very helpful. And this is where, and you'll know if a student has requested accommodations, you get your accommodation notice. You don't necessarily know what they are unless students sort of self-disclose or something like that. And they can choose to do that, but many do not. But at that point, if you have that letter, it's not unreasonable to have the director and say, I have a student who's getting services through your office. The student is being a problem in this class, and I want to understand if there's an intersection and if I can get some expertise on strategies to best deal with it.
Yeah, and even in there, right, I've had one recently that happened to a colleague where it was about like, well, you normally do this at this time of day, and that student's particular accommodations, just they really have some structure, right? When you violate the structure or you move outside the norms, that's when they get really uncomfortable, right? And we'll call out that like, well, you didn't do this, or you said you were going to do that. You're a bad instructor. It's like, okay, well, no, right? But understanding that individual student, but also understanding when things become kind of this repeated, right? Putting it in context of every class period, having that vibe change when one person exits and enters the room, or having that sigh of relief, or we've seen that, the other students make eye contact with you and they're like, what is going on? And you have to figure out how to reply. So, to start complicating some of our examples, one thing we were thinking about was, if this continues, right? They continue this. It's an everyday battle. You're having to, be like Professor Chenis, and now every day is a pop quiz. Every day is a iClicker quiz on the reading. Every day is defending these choices. Every day is.
But when the disruption is really, it's unacceptable. It's really out of the line. It's not just disagreeing with the reading or disagreeing with an instructor and things like that. I think what's also important is the first point of contact has to be in private with the student. Maybe it happens by email, maybe it happens in person after class, but really you don't go to DEFCON 5 by starting an argument in front of the class. I mean, I would say, as a mentor to junior faculty, like, first of all, students will essentially turn on you even if they didn't like it, because students don't like to see classmates being singled out. There's a power differential and they bristle at it, right? Because they can see it as an abuse of that power differential, right? So the first, right, you really want to start with the smallest, I guess, engagement, or the most minimally threatening engagement, and you have to escalate as needed. And so, it really starts with a private conversation.
Yep.
And it says, this attitude and stuff is affecting the class. There are ways that you channel legitimately an academic debate, your issues with readings or things like that. And, they have a certain amount of courtesy and respect for the classroom community and stuff like that.
Yeah. And definitely in there, right, that's one that kind of reading that, temperature. I found that, kind of like Pat came up, sometimes students will share things with you individually, and they may recognize their own behavior and be like, I know I'm kind of like this. And,
they appreciate, they don't have the social cues. Someone on the spectrum actually really appreciates that's trying to really function in good faith. Like, I appreciate you calling me out because I don't pick up the cue. So other students could be rolling eyes or whatever, and students won't pick up that cue. Yeah. And there are ways to do it. I was talking when we were preparing, I was talking to Andrea, and I said I had a student who had several disabling, conditions and was receiving services. It was upfront with me and says, I asked too many questions. And I would just decide they were really good questions. So other students would get annoyed. I'm like, maybe you should listen, because this guy is on fire here. Right. But, and so we came up with a system, and the system was, I can't even remember now if they were index cards or poker chips, but I gave him so many at the beginning of the class. And once he'd use them, he could use, they were cards, because then he could use the card to then write it instead of say it. And then I promised we would find time to go over every single one. And so that, that was something. And in that case, it was a case where the student appreciated it, right? The student had a learning disability, knew it was a problem, but was never self-aware in the moment. And now they got sort of this commitment device that constrained that behavior.
Yeah, and I've also found that sometimes adding in that one-on-one, they might just have a lot that they want to say, and figuring out how to channel it, it can give that opportunity. So in there, I think what we kind of bring up and want to think about too
is, thinking from our partners in, this might not always be the things that our friends in the Dean of Students office hear of unless we're talking about it, right? These ones aren't as common, but we do have the resources from the Dean of Students office, that green folder that we have, kind of goes through exactly what we said here, right? You can recognize the behaviors, the interruptions, right? Being able to respond. Part of it is, starting with some expectations. So, especially if it's that one-off, right? First time it kind of happens, hey, can we just chat real quick? What's going on, right? Then being able to think that, yes, there are some larger things that can get escalated, but this is also where, like Liz brought up, right? You are part of a team, just like we give team support to our students. So thinking who else is on your team that maybe you need to loop someone in, maybe you need to loop in the Dean of Students as well.
Yeah, I would just, highlight, even if you're having that individual one-on-one meeting, to document that. And you can do that in your own documentation, or you can add it to a starfish flag, just so the advisor's also clued in. Like, that's really where that network is kind of starting to form. And if the student is coming up on our radar in other spaces, if we go to starfish and we say, oh, we can see that they've been struggling a little bit in this one course, it looks like they've been getting some feedback from their faculty, it just kind of adds to a picture for us to help that student better. And so anytime you have the opportunity to put in documentation, whether it's, I met with a student today to talk about some class disruptions, or they didn't agree with the material, it doesn't have to be specific to the learning disability, for example, if they share that. But it's helpful for us to see a fuller picture. Often when we get reports of students, to be honest with you, they're usually not a surprise. Students are on our radars for different reasons, but it does help us see a bigger picture, especially with the new ACT team, academic care team, and our care team that kind of takes it to the next level for behavior. That really does help us see, the students, struggling in this course, but they're not going to any of their other classes. So something's bringing them to this class, right? So, sometimes it's a strength, even though it feels like a struggle. And so, those are some of the things that we would ask for in your response. So if you can document it, let us know. If you're not sure about starfish, there's trainings available. We can help you anytime to know what is the best thing to add. But really, any note you put in there, we will be able to see. And as we go through some of the other examples, there are times where you might want a behavioral flag for kind of larger disruptions or concerns. And that's also something that gets right back to us. So that'll be another option for you.
Yeah. So I have a couple others, and again, we kind of came up with another one that points out, as Liz said, that behaviors can kind of start in that moment, but start changing a little bit. And so again, this kind of gets at an anonymized way that I've seen some things happen too, right? When you're maybe not in that full, like right now standing in front of an entire class and this sort of thing, you're in these smaller conferences and smaller groups that are really common in a lot of our classes, right? We're working with students, we're guiding them in their own little peer groups of what's happening. And so, there could be a case where you're meeting with this group and student B, member of this group, is sitting there and becomes really agitated, right? Start to see, right, that's the indicators of stress, how we all might feel in meetings that could have been emails, but at the extreme, right? Just starting to, become really agitated, right? We can feel that nervous energy, right? As you're walking through what a group, okay, so our next steps are, oh, this looks really good, but, one thing your group needs to address is this, what about that, right? Starts to kind of respond and focus in on their own actions in that group, starts to freak out, and that's really just a freak out, right? Pushes away, right? We get a little bit of that, oh no. So seeing that, losing a little bit of control, right? An outburst really is what we might see, right? An outburst that might have some unintended consequences, right? Devices go flying, or feeling like, oh no, this thing's going on. So to borrow Liz's language, I'm kind of labeling this behavior when I've encountered a similar situation or heard about a similar situation. I think that's the biggest thing, is recognizing that student is experiencing some distress. It might not even be the group situation. It might kind of be the group. It might be that like larger internal turmoil of like, oh, if this group project goes poorly and that's 40% of my grade, or, oh, my group members don't like me, or I'm not understanding what's going on. There's some different strategies. So keeping an eye on the chat, but when I think about what sort of strategies I might start with, right, if, I've had these sorts of things happen, right, one person just kind of exits, right? They might take themselves out of the situation to cool down. That's really nice. I can give a quick check-in, like, hey, everyone here okay? Like, how are you feeling? Right, the person that might have had like a phone or things, their own stuff. Are we okay? Right? How are you doing? How's everyone doing? Is it okay if I go check on that person? So I will say this is not a plug for Hewitt because it has its own problems, but having the space outside of the classrooms, I found that being able to pop out there real quick has been super helpful to kind of like, hey, what's going on? Are you okay? Right? The good and bad is that means that someone's freak out is on display and we're seeing them crash out in real time, but being able to maybe calm down and say, hey, what's going on and figure out what works. So I know in terms of situations like that, that's usually where I start. This to me starts to get a little more into where my spidey senses are tingling and I'm like, I need to tell someone. I need someone more than me, right? It's not just like, hey, you didn't like my reading or you're acting, but I need to check in both on the group members. I need to check in and I probably need to loop in some other individuals. It's like in the moment, right? That's the stuff when I've had these things sort of happen. That's, I'm contacting the dean of students for grace, right? Just like, hey, here is this incident. Also reaching out to my department chair, right? Hey, you've had the student, you know them, this is what they did, and then like, oh no, right? And we start to kind of like we say, if it's happening to you, it's happening in other areas and kind of figuring out, right? Is this just that moment? It's really hard to handle a lot of things in life. And if they're in kind of that internal panic, but also checking in on those other students, right? I found in situations like this, usually the other students, again, are really concerned. They're just like, whoa.
Tend to be more concerned.
Yeah.
Especially if it's a one-off. Again, I think a one-off, you could start privately and it might not happen again. And the student, I usually give them, if they don't time out themselves, I sort of give them permission. I'm like, would you like to step out a moment? You have my permission to do so, right? It's not going to count against you. Or, if it's bad enough or you're near enough the end of class, you're like, look, clearly something's going on with you. We're all concerned. If you actually want to, gather your stuff and leave, I will catch you up and we will recoup and we will start fresh.
Yeah.
And I used to, I'm dating myself here because this doesn't work anymore, but I used to call it the full magnet doodle because the magnet doodle, you switch the thing and all the magnet pictures disappear and you have a fresh screen. You have a fresh slate. And how great does that feel? Right. So I used to call it a magnet doodle moment, but that's not really a good thing anymore. So I don't have a cool name anymore. Sorry. So that's, I think you start with that, but I think the repeated behavior, and now it's like students aren't just getting cheated with vibes, they're getting cheated with the sense of personal safety at some point and physical discomfort in the classroom. So, I can justify to students, there's a one-off and there's just a one-off. And then I would absolutely escalate it. It's almost a one strike rule that you begin to escalate and you have to be concerned about the feelings for students in the room.
Yeah, because especially, right, I know for students and for us, our devices are no longer just like this thing, but like when you like the number of things I've dropped, lost control of, right? It's like, it's not always intentional, but like, having that happen, right, can be really scary for everyone of just like, oh, this thing's now suddenly in my space. This device that's yours is now, like on the ground. It might be like, oh no. So even taking that moment, right, accidents can happen, but it's also if everyone's kind of at that heightened moment, right, this is where we get really concerned about everyone. So this next slide is not necessarily going to look too different. When you read the student code of conduct, right, obviously, we're starting to see that there's a lot of behaviors that might fall in different places. I don't know if this one really is like, when we're reading, we're like, part B says endangering. Well, part of it is over time, right? Who's endangered and making sure that people are aware. So again, it really starts to become the same sort of responses, but I think in here, as we escalate, we're really seeing the need to not just consider going to that mentor, going to Liz and be like, this weird thing happened to me, right? I've only been teaching in this, modality, like, I don't know, 10 times. Wow, I've never had this happen before. But starting to bring in other experts and people that might be aware, like Grace behind the scenes of like, hey, this student has some stuff, right? They might be disclosing to some people some information, right? It might be the anniversary of a death. It might be some other personal thing that's kind of
latent under that surface, but, trying to get them in and getting them into the care team and getting them into the resources.
I would say some of the more successful kind of strategies that we've seen on our end is when faculty, do what you can to make sure that the space is safe and that you're safe and the students are safe and the student is safe. And then following up, I like that you mentioned earlier, following up with the students in the class, make sure they're okay, that they have the resources that they need, maybe to process what they experienced or saw, or, the feelings that they're having around that moment. Also for yourself as a faculty or staff member to check in with your supervisor or folks that you trust to kind of help process through what happened, but also your response and what you would want to do differently. In some of these cases, if a student maybe is doing this repeatedly, or it seems like it's something that might happen again, it's nice to have a one-on-one with them. And sometimes you can bring in your chair or bring in other support people from across campus to maybe come up with a contract of, if this happens again, I will remove myself from the classroom if I'm feeling overwhelmed. Kind of coming up with some really specific strategies for those students to follow. And also for the faculty to know what resources, maybe it's the card situation, maybe there's something that the faculty can kind of commit to and supporting that student. And also providing space. So if you attended the What to Do with Student Complaints session with Kristen Croyle, she talked about doing a feedback form with students like at the middle of the semester, but you could even send that out like quarter of the semester and kind of get that feedback of, how is the vibe? Like do that vibe check. It could be anonymous. It could be a Mentimeter just to you, not on the screen type of thing, to see if you need to kind of check in with the class a little bit more.
Absolutely. You can do exit tickets. I think exit rather than a full out feedback form, do a quick one, targeted exit ticket. I will say again, the iClicker anonymous feature and free response allows you to do the quick equivalent of an exit ticket, really ensuring that everyone responds and people can respond like, I got nothing or whatever, cool and whatever. But, that making sure you actually hear from everybody is a way to get that done. And again, accessibility, if someone has an outburst and you find, if you actually know that they are receiving service through accessibility services, again, another option is really a conference with the director there. And, that conference might bring in coping mechanisms and things like that you can agree on.
The counseling center is a really great resource too. And as we talk, as it escalates to more physical, emotional disruptions that we're seeing, don't be afraid to call them, especially during the working hours. You can call their number directly. After hours, University Police has a direct line to the counselor on call. And so you could even call University Police and say, hey, I'd like to talk to the crisis counselor from Oswego, whatever the resource might be. And because we don't expect you to be a counselor in these situations either. Right? And so university, especially for the folks that are teaching after hours, University Police is a great resource. Doesn't mean they're going to come in guns blazing, right? Like they're not going to be patrolling the area if you don't want that, but they are a good resource to kind of consult with if you feel like someone's in danger of for themselves or for others. That's a really great place to start. During the working hours as well, they're available, but we also have counseling open. Our office is open, so you're always welcome to call and consult. I have a student who seems upset. They've had some disruption in the class, can you check in with the other students? Can you check in with this student? And we'd be happy to help. So.
Yeah, and I think this gets in, I'm really excited to see this question in the chat and hopefully others will chime in. But as we're getting, Pat Clark brings up in terms of mitigating outbursts, what do folks think about giving trigger warnings? Like how might this?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of what I call content warnings. So trigger assumes someone else's response. I like to have a content warning. So I have content that I know may affect people in different ways. And so I usually give them a heads up, and I have maybe, and this is the class, in fact, maybe you can do an alternative assignment because mine are very isolating, but here's an example, an intro to social sciences, right? Durkheim has this seminal work about suicide, right? And it's really the scientific method in social science, right? Distinguishing social science from the humanities is considered sort of a dividing point in how you really sort of carefully scientifically, and a lot of the work still holds up. Well, everybody in a class of 22 knows someone who has at least attempted, if not successfully committed suicide. There's just no way in that class of 22 that someone is distant from it. Could be a neighbor, classmate, could be someone very close in the family, right? Could be very fresh, could be distant. right? So I think that needs a content warning.
Mhm.
And, particularly, if someone, it's really fresh for someone, maybe they should be excused from talking about that or things like that. So on the other hand, I'm not really willing to say this is, if it's a intro to social sciences, there will be controversial issues, right? So I'm not willing to give up this work, but I often refer to them as content warning. And, these things happen, they don't manifest themselves in class, they get outside. I would say just about a year ago, fall of 2024, I had a student almost had a panic attack in the office because another instructor had a reading, again, germane to the class. I actually think a very important reading, but the reading included sexual violence against women. It was a reading about slavery, particularly slavery in Caribbean and the brutality of women. And she was a survivor of sexual violence, and she was really kind of it really brought back things and made her kind of really struggle. That week she was struggling and all of that. And I don't think the instructor thought about a content warning, right? But, in hindsight, they sort of did. But so it can trigger that outward behavior. Sometimes it's just really silent behavior that we won't see. But I guess that was a long answer to Pat's question. But I do. I mean, I think there's some obvious things. I think it gets harder, Pat, when someone says this triggered me and you're like, really? Because it was, I'm sorry, the dog got sick, but what I didn't, I can't, so there's some judgment on your part of what's the content warning. I think the suicide and the sexual violence ones were actually particularly clear that those were probably, but a pet dying, I don't know, or, so things like that, something that might be about a car accident, those get a little bit harder.
Yeah.
So I would say for instructors here is, you need to be forgiving on yourself if you can't anticipate everything that might upset someone as well. But you got to look at your content and maybe think about it to try and head it off. But if the content was behind it, you find out after the fact, then, I think, again, it helps to bring on the student as the partner and talk about a plan.
Yeah, and I think that also goes back to kind of what we started with too, which is recognizing, the individual student experiences. We can't know everything that's kind of walking into our classroom. So again, you might not know the dog thing, or like, oh, your dad just died. Like, I wouldn't know that unless, you told me. So I didn't know this reading that happened to mention parents would be the thing that, triggers. But it's, even like we saw, right, starting with some like questions or even, like a pop quiz, or sometimes not even a pop quiz, but like, hey, we're going to talk about this reading. Take a second to get your thoughts organized, right? I found that sometimes in doing that, like I have had a student be like, I can't talk about this right now. This thing happened. And you're like, okay, well, here's how we could do this. Right? Thanks for letting me know. You do the little like whisper check-in on everyone, give them a second to pull up their readings. And in there, especially if you're going to move to discussion, or like we were talking about too in our prep session, right? Sometimes, the world is changing, and what we might see, teaching an education class right now, this is this, or these policies can kind of give a chance to separate out some of that. So I do think, giving some warning, but we can't predict absolutely everything, or how someone might respond even hours later. If they're sitting in that other class and they go, I talked about this morning, now I'm talking about this. Oh my God, right? And they're like, oh, you just happen to be in the moment and now it's hitting you. So couldn't have even warned what would happen.
We have a faculty that on a very regular basis, it's almost like clockwork, I'm sure it is for their schedule. They meet with the students that are maybe struggling in the class. So sometimes it's not even an outburst. Maybe the grades are really low, or there's inconsistencies in attendance. Yeah. And they'll send us a quick message that says, hey, I met with this student. Seems like there's a lot going on. They could use extra support. That's all they say. And if it's the student on our radar, that's all we need to know. We don't need all the details. And then our team follows up, whether it's the counseling center, ourselves, maybe Res Life with the students on campus, or another kind of connection point that we're aware of. So when I spoke earlier about the documentation, it doesn't have to be a dissertation. Sometimes it can be a quick, hey, I'm kind of concerned about the student. This is what I know, or this is what I can share. And then we'll hit the ground running. So really any information is helpful for us in the long run.
Yeah, and I think that's helpful too, because it kind of recognizes like we're teaching content, but but we're also, sometimes the thing that actually causes that trigger is more like the impending stress of being a student. Where you're like, oh my God, what do you mean this paper's worth 25% of my grade? And oh no, I forgot that participation actually counts on attendance. I'm now going to fail this. And it's like those sorts of things that then impact even how you can read and interpret content, right? It's hard to sit in a class and you're like, well, wait, now I realized I'm supposed to be participating. So having that too, I think is helpful because it recognizes, even in there's some framing like, hey, trying your best. I like the kind of wipe the slate clean, but like, hey, you're trying your best every day, right? Good intentions, and you are doing what you can, right? And those sorts of things can happen, but it's hard to predict individual what it is that's going to maybe cause someone to get a little super stressed out. So we've kind of gotten to everything that we wanted to make sure with the two kind of cases that lead in to get a little bit more serious, right? If behavior is maybe one time or recurring, if you're going to use the same strategy every time, you might find that doesn't work either. So you might have to adjust, what to do to make sure you feel protected as well as others. So what we have prepared, and this is where we would love to instead hear from you if you want to bring forward something, is we do have some other, oh yeah, I like this.
Yeah, that definitely works, Dr. Clark. I've used that before, like a classroom tenets type of thing in the beginning of the year. Particularly around difficult content that might be coming up, just to kind of first you get a pulse early, right, of how students are going to handle the situation and the content, but also it really opens up the discussion. So I really like that strategy.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to too, where we started in recognizing like you as an instructor, right? Your classroom management, part of this is strategy, right? How do you talk about it? Just because you write on the syllabus, like, hey, we're going to encounter some difficult topics doesn't mean students are actually thinking about that in real time on that random Tuesday where you're actually talking about that reading. So I think in there, that is really helpful too. And even taking that time to like refresh and like remind people, right? Like, hey, we said we're going to talk about some difficult stuff. We are there, right? Hey, friends, now it's time. So I think that that's really important as well.
I've actually referred back to that contract halfway through the semester and said, okay, we're about to get into our group work part of the class. We're going to review our tenets, or we're going to review our kind of goals as a classroom. Do you want to change anything before you start working with each other? And I found that that's helpful too, just to kind of go back to it once they've learned each other a little bit in the classroom, so they can share.
Yeah. And Laura has done exactly what I hoped, which was be able to bring some scenarios in. So it's a little close to kind of, we have other things, but sometimes I'm just going to read it out loud so everyone can see it, that sometimes behavior is distressing enough that faculty are concerned to just dismiss a student or let them know they can dismiss themselves without taking the time to ensure they need immediate support. But needing to assist the distressed student in real time sometimes pulls the professor out of class. One-off, totally reasonable. But in repeated situations, it feels like a catch-22, trying to serve both the distressed student and a class as a whole. Any advice?
Well, I think first you would start with being really clear with the student and say, the first time it happens, you're like, again, this is a one-off, flip that Magnadoodle, right? So I don't let me do that in the spring. They're going to look at me like I'm an idiot. All right. It's like when you reference a movie from the 80s and like, what? Okay. Anyway, but then one time, but you actually say, I can't repeatedly do this, right? So then you're like, what is the strategy? Right. What do you recommend I do? Do you want to be left alone? And then, and honestly, and if it happens again and the student said they want to be left alone or what, then I do think you're reaching out with the behavioral concern and say exactly what Laura said in her chat is that I can't do both. Right. This is repeated. This was not a one-off. I can't do both. And, I have concerns about the students. I have a responsibility of using my class time as well. And see what kind of, because I think it can be context, fact specific about what is actually causing the behavior for the students, which is why I think it's really important to bring in a team to help you.
And we've had follow-up before. I can think of a case from last semester where the student was doing kind of a repeated behavior that was disruptive. And really it was an individual behavior, but it was still kind of impacting the teams around them. And they talked with the faculty, which was great, but I met with the student and just kind of said, hey, like, what's going on? Just kind of, if they didn't feel comfortable sharing with the faculty because maybe that power dynamic or other things at play, having that kind of outside person to talk to, maybe talk through some strategies, I think it helped. And, I was able to follow up with the faculty with the strategies that we kind of agreed on, for that individual student and that behavior.
Yeah, and I think this really starts to point out some of the complications in these situations, right? Because, we have some competing goals, right? We want to make sure all of our students are able to have a good classroom experience, learn what they need to learn while they're there. And sometimes those disruptions, right, they're going to be, they're going to change what's happening, but it also puts the instructors in those challenging positions, right? So yeah, reaching out to your chair too, right? But then that becomes that challenge for a chair, right? Are they now going to have to sit outside and walk through every 20, 30 minutes, right? To try and figure out what's going to work, right? Because I think one thing that we haven't touched on that came up a lot when we were prepping is that oftentimes things take a lot longer, right? So what you might see in week 2 or 3 of the semester, it's still going on. It's now week 4, 5, 6, 8, 12. And, sometimes that's where it gets extra stressful, is recognizing, it changes how you approach that class. You come in and you're like, oh God, what is it going to be today? Right? You can do as many of the great strategies. You can, start with all this stuff. But when you also don't know, I think that's where things get really challenging,
especially for those weekly courses, right? So you only have one day a week that you can kind of see if there's been a change in behavior. And sometimes we can't expect a change in behavior overnight or even over a week. But it's because we have teams, right? We can all kind of work with that student or work with that situation to help maybe monitor their progress or see how they're doing before the class even comes about. The other thing I'm thinking about this one too is, it's good to talk with the student, but if there's kind of this repetitive behavior, I would clue in the advisor, right? Because maybe there's something going on with the class, or maybe, maybe they have other options for that class or that credential, credit, whatever they're looking for. If we've talked about accessibility resources, but maybe even counseling if the student's continuing to be triggered or whatever the case might be that's putting them in distress. They might need to talk with somebody professionally about what is happening. So I would.
And depending on the original modality of the class, sometimes modality pivots are an option. One of the mentions I mentioned earlier about the student that was going to ruin the vibe in the class. The faculty member was just like, what I'd really like to do is move the student asynchronous online. I was like, well, you shouldn't have to do that, because, that's not workload neutral, right? But she was actually that was actually her preference of how to handle it. I'm like, well, I think you can always ask the student if it's mutual agreement, then I don't think there's any issue. If the student pushed back, I think you have a problem. And it turned out to be mutual agreement. So again, like I said, that's not workload neutral, and it kind of puts an onus on a faculty member to try and solve a problem of not their creation. So I understand why people would push back, but sometimes you're already in a modality or even materials for a web enhanced face-to-face where that pivot is actually going to be made much less work, much less stressful, and a much better outcome for actually everyone involved. And I think that kind of pivot, we're mutually agreed. And any kind of pivot like that, I strongly recommend a learning agreement, right? So now that you've switched the modality, you have a learning agreement, acknowledges it. What are the expectations, how you're going to be graded and everything for the rest of the semester? What are the instructor's obligations and what are your obligations to complete the class successfully? And that's all kind of written down and understood. Right.
Yeah, and I think in there, right, that's another challenge too, right?
And some of them won't be easier. I just want to, so like a literature course, particularly once it's meeting once a week, that's like, yikes.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I don't even think that's an option.
Yeah.
Like I said, some of the courses, it's a small pivot.
Yeah.
That's actually going to be overall less work for the instructor to deal
Sometimes
with.
with the peer review, you can't get it.
Right, but there are classes where you're right, or the chemistry lab where someone gets mad and is breaking beakers or whatever, right? So nope, not going to happen. So that's going to be a very specific niche where that becomes an option.
And I think in there, it touches on one resource that is in the green folder that we haven't really brought up, but I know we have kind of listed in our slides elsewhere. at some point, right, this is why we have associate deans and, going to them as well, not just like dean of students, not just
That's right, Paul, I
chair.
saw you there.
But yes, I did see Paul is on this, right?
Camera off.
And he's probably left, he's like, oh,
I
no.
know watching it.
I think in there, right, that's where, you start kind of, okay, let me try in that moment, let me, follow up after, and then, okay, this is still going. At some point, right, this is where, I always think like beyond my pay grade, right? I need my deans involved in this, not just like, dean of students that can kind of get that holistic perspective, but also, being asked to change modalities or do all that, right? I might not, as a junior faculty that, over accommodating at times, that might be the straw that breaks my back that semester where I go, I can't do this anymore. I can't now do this and do this and do this. And I don't feel safe and I don't feel comfortable and I'm overwhelmed and this is it. And it's, being able to bring in deans, being able to like recognize that there are some things that have to get escalated is part of that, right? And documenting, bringing in people, but also trying to figure out what's going to make sense, that it's student-led or faculty-led, but that kind of mutual agreement, right? Because you might have a student that says, no, I want to participate exactly as intended. I want to do this. And you go, that is not working. This is where, deans. So I think, Laura, this is what we had hoped for, was getting to hear some examples and, some situations. But I think what this starts to point out is how, we have some good procedures in place and we have some resources and, but a lot of these individual situations are going to have to be bringing things forward. Right. Michael says things, good practice and thinking about what to do before it happens and how you react is key. Yeah, I think
Absolutely.
so too.
I think these other ones, C and D really quickly. D is almost easier for the instructor because this is not a homemade solution.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, this is like really specific causes and then you really need help and you escalate. So I think, D is immediately sort of a behavioral flag, I think. And depending on the extent of the evidence and whether or not you think it's danger, it's potentially a wellness check from UUP.
Yeah.
And I know people are very reluctant to politicize or whatever, a lot of incidents that they feel should be de-escalated, but university police are de-escalators. I've asked personally for 2 welfare checks on students, calling them directly. And I have actually gone with one student who was worried about a boyfriend who wasn't even a member of the campus coming to cause trouble because they'd had a nasty breakup when she was home over spring break and she was worried. And, they handled it amazingly, and really the wellness checks, were not sort of threatening or pushing her anyway. They were, and all 3 students talked about what a beneficial, positive interaction it was. And in one case, the student grew up in the Bronx and did not have a very good opinion of NYPD. Right. She was a young Black woman and she was incredibly suspicious of law enforcement. And she told me she saw a part of it that she didn't actually think that police would do or something. It became a very positive interaction and everything. So I know people are very reluctant to sort of just call the police because you don't know what escalation is going to happen and you don't want to be responsible for starting the chain. But I think our university police officers are.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I would say that's something else that kind of came up when we were prepping these scenarios, right? So like the computer, if you read the green folder, right, there's the example of like, the sort of harassment that starts to happen online. I guess the good part in that is always like, hey, student C, guess what? I can forward, either forward, like receipts, not dealing with this, right? But then also as student D, one thing that we were talking about was recognizing, again, us as faculty, we wear many hats, but those hats don't have to be, you're not the counselor, you are not the you don't have to be like, let's test you, hold on, right? So something like that too, right? That's why we have these larger teams and being able to bring in that this campus, right? We have some commitments, in terms of making sure that students have these resources and education about resources, but also these checks, right?
Right.
That's
it is, and it's, faculty, your colleagues will say, I can't be everything. I'm like, I don't think anyone's really asking you to. They're asking you to be the referrer. So I'm asking you to be informed enough about the resources, right? Which honestly, you have to live in a sensory deprivation tank if you're not around this campus. So you've made a deliberate decision to ignore everything around you if you don't, right? So I think you have to be, ready to refer, if only, if you only remember one thing, I would do the starfish behavioral flight and let people take it from there. You had to do only one thing. And again, I think I'm in my 38th year, so the old timers even resent having to do that. But I got to tell you, the alternative is in Generation X went to college, which is my cohort. A lot of people, a lot of young adults got thrown away. Their human capital got thrown away. They didn't make it through, right? Colleges had an attrition model and not a development model. And, I think we expended a lot of resources that didn't develop people as human capital and engaged citizens and serve the public good because we just didn't want to deal with it. We wanted to deal with the ones that were easy to deal with, right? And really, that we weren't legally required to. So ADA in 1992, I'm in the middle of graduate school when that passes. And so in a lot of ways, they just weren't required to. And so they didn't. So I think it's a different world today, and that can be a lot more stressful to instructors. But for all of us who pursued a career in education, I think the alternative was worse. And a lot of us are old enough to have lived during that alternative.
And I think, Andrea, you mentioned this is an educational process. So say student D is under the influence of anything, right? They come to class and the faculty puts a report in. Although it is a policy violation, they might have a meeting with conduct. It does not mean that they will be charged necessarily. Often we have those educational conversations and we connect them to resources like our AOD, Assistant Dean, Trisha DeWolf. Maybe it's counseling, maybe it's other resources in the community, depending on where they're at in their life. And so just know that by letting us know, it doesn't mean that they've thrown their education away because they'll be charged with, being under the influence in a lab. It's not what's going to happen.
And these developmental models pivot. So as we kind of hear giving it my sage advice as the old timer, I want to be transparent about my failures as well. And so I'll say I'm going to say around 2015, I'm teaching a large lecture. There's probably 200 students in it. And I'm looking in the back and I'm like, why is the student sucking on their USB drive? Well, it's a vape. And I just immediately pointed and I said, are you kidding me? And, and it's legendary. Like a student was in that class and later worked with my husband or something. I'm like, do you know what your wife did? I'm like, oh, son of a. And so it is. It's my legacy to approximately 200 students that are probably alumni of this venerated institution. But, right. So, but there are different options now. And apparently, and that student wasn't in distress. That student was just being rude and vaping, right? But I'm just saying, people evolve, and with resources and your philosophy of education evolves.
Yeah, and to add to that briefly, so two things. So one, on topic, two, this exactly right. I've kind of reacted the other way where it's like, oh boy, I know what you were up to, right? If you think I may be old to you, but I'm not that old, right? In there, that is one that may be going back to those strategies, not really like calling out in the moment. We're all do stupid things when we're kids and, learning like, it was more drunkenness at my previous institution because of a culture of drinking, right? But being able to, kind of recognize like in that moment, like, all right, yes, that might be the time to just kind of be like, dude, think maybe you imbibed a little too much before coming here, right? It really depends on you and that relationship with that student. Some of them will just explicitly tell you, this is what I did. I don't need to know. But I'm almost like the opposite of Liz, where if that were happening, I'd be like, oh, I'm not saying anything out loud in this, So I'm just going to afterwards be like, can you not come to class smelling like pot? Like, that's really, I don't love this, right? I don't love this for me or for you. So I think that in there, right, it kind of goes back to recognizing you have some individual choices, figuring out also what you're kind of comfortable with, but that's where I'd be like, oh, and then I might, it's again, repeated. If it's wake and bake, then I need to probably get them to some of that developmental model of like learning what resources are and how to cope with problems where yes, wake and bake might help you in that moment, but it's not actually helping you overall. And then as people are, this session does go, we have until 11:20, which is why we have built in time for us to talk through examples. We have a couple other points. But as people are either leaving, one thing that is also happening that's separate from here but connected
is we are working on a faculty-led disruptive student policy, right? One that faculty are going to have input in that would correlate and complement like the Dean of Students Code of Conduct, but recognize, and give faculty a little bit more kind of guidelines and opportunities of what can they do, right? Because I think what we're really wanting to drive home is, this isn't a world where, okay, you did this thing, kick you out, you never come back to class, like do not pass code, drop this class right away. We never want to see you again. Goodbye, right? And I think that's that big challenge. So as we are moving into these other scenarios, something to keep in mind is if you have specific things, comments, concerns that relate to a faculty disruptive student policy, contact Gwen K or myself. That's where Gwen K has to go, is to that meeting. And I'll be joining her later to unpack. But I think this is why we wanted to make sure we had time to do this, because it's important to us, like policy comes out of somewhere, but it comes out of our experiences and a need for it. And what we're seeing is there is no one size fits all way of responding. There's ways we can work with the resources on campus and also empower you as faculty on how to feel that, it's like, oh no, you're not going to be like, you did it wrong. You ignored the problem. And then you told someone later, right? Like that is not how this works. So we want to make sure that we have some resources. And I think that's what Laura kind of got at, appreciate resources, and we need recourse for situations that are repeated and extreme. And yeah, that's, we do have some more extreme examples. Notice with E, right? E for extreme and F for not fun. So I think in there, right, one thing that we wanted to recognize, Grace, I think you told me there's been very, very few like true extreme stuff, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah. So, and especially, my knowledge base is only from the last year and a half from like boots on the ground experience. But with the implementation of the ACT team and the CARE team, our behavioral intervention team, which is, the Scott Swayze and Lynn and Christy and myself, Ramin, different people from all across campus. We've only had 2 bit cases last semester compared to who knows how many in years before. The CARE team had roughly, I think it was like 175, and academic care team was maybe close to 200. And I think a lot of those interventions have helped kind of aid in some of these more extreme cases. Now, sometimes these extreme cases, they get to our level, but we've seen it bubbling, right? Like they're not a surprise. And we kind of have already been working on different attempts and strategies, resources for the student and for the campus community. And last semester out of the 2, I think one, wanted to withdraw from school. So we helped them with that process. And the other one, we worked through some different strategies and resources for them to be successful and safe. And I think, in some of these cases, again, to our point earlier about university, please call. Don't ever feel like you should stay in a space where you feel threatened, or a student feels threatened, or a class feels threatened. We want to make sure that you feel supported. And sometimes that is having university police show up.
And physical intimidation.
Yes.
Physical intimidation. It's not even explicit. And again, these are things I would have done differently, because you're right. In older times, I was more reluctant to call the police and understand their role. But there were times where I basically saw at a distance a sociology professor, no longer here, and an older student. And it was just, I thought, kind of the most alarming kind of physical stance, without actually, pushing or anything like that. But, standing over her, very angry, very nonverbal communication and all of that. And, I regret, even in my younger days, not coming up and saying, is everything okay? Would you like me to stay? Which is what I do today. Or even encouraging her to actually file a report and document it. Because again, the student probably isn't just a problem in one spot. I think that those are things that I do now under the current environment that we have built for student support that I didn't think of in my younger years.
And yeah, for E, especially with self-harm, sometimes self-harm isn't it doesn't necessarily equate to like suicidal ideation, for example, but it is concerning, it is alarming, and we want to make sure that the student has their resources. And so that's, again, you know, you raise a behavioral flag, or you just email me directly, or you put in a student concern report. You can do all of those things. It'll go to the same place. But then we will have our team respond as soon as we can. So usually a counselor will call student directly, or if they're on campus, Res Life might follow up directly, just to make sure that they're in a safe place and that they have the resources that they need. So again, both situations, call us, call UP. It will get to the right person. You just have to let us know.
Yeah, and I think getting in here, I mean, as Laura, before she left, dropped in the chat too, right? Making sure that, you know, there's more recourse for these sorts of situations.
Yeah.
I think these extreme situations are also that concern, right? You know, it is probably on the back of everyone's mind. And as we talked about in our prep session, right, there are different state historical events that impact, right, what might happen and, you know, how policy is developed, right, and what sort of resources there are, and also just kind of the general feeling towards things. So, you know, if you were in Virginia and you were teaching at a school and, you know, you have Virginia text right on your mind, or if you were in grad school at the University of Iowa, when there were extreme cases of gun violence towards fellow faculty and professors and provosts, you know, I think that's the larger thing is, you know, we recognize these bigger picture things are there, right? They start to get at states, they start to get at historical events that affect us all. But it's also that challenge because just because it's on our mind doesn't mean every situation is going to escalate into that, but it is certainly why we want to make sure that when we start to hit that extreme, things have been bubbling up for some people for a long time, but if we're at the extreme, hopefully we've tried to do the smaller steps along the way.
I think that's a frustration too sometimes is with the conduct, like if it gets to a level of conduct, if the student isn't an immediate threat and that, you know, and the conduct assessment team has decided that and has enough information to make that decision, the student is still, they still have their due process rights, right? They still have a right to an education. And so how do we balance that as a team and making sure everyone is safe and, you know, making sure that we have all the right supports and resources in place without necessarily interfering with that education. Now, interim suspensions do happen. They're usually at a university level, so we can't necessarily internally suspend a student from one individual class. That also gets into a complication. So the student might be great in all these other classes, right? And there's just this one that seems to be the trigger or whatever the case might be. And so that's where the team, you know, comes into play when it comes to making those decisions and looking at the resources available and the best process for that student to kind of go through to make sure that everyone's safe.
Agreed. And I think, you know, we've kind of gotten to that, but I think while we're chatting, this is also really helpful to have up because it starts to illustrate as we move through these different resources, right? If you just read the green folder, it does get a little repetitive after a while, like do this, do this, do this.
Not forget.
Yeah.
It feels like a list of strategies.
Yeah.
But when we were starting to think about this too, right, we wanted to make sure, you know, something that is helpful nowadays where you have to bring your phone to log into everything, right? Make sure you have your department chair's phone number. Making sure, I mean, I don't know if your dean is open to it, having your dean's number, right, or having that as well. But this is where, right, when we hit some of those extreme examples, yeah, please, for your own safety, for everyone else's safety.
Right.
This is
And this is why UUP is important because UUP always answers their phone. And we had an issue when I was chair in economics, it's almost 20 years ago now. And it was a week after Virginia Tech, where a student who I know in hindsight, they weren't serious. The student had stopped taking medication for a very serious condition but in hindsight, but at the time, this whole thing unfolded over a weekend before finals. It was Mother's Day weekend. And this whole thing unfolded and parents were calling me into class and is this kid going to come show up to finals and what's he going to do? Because he'd made a bunch of threats online in the online space of the class. And right. And so then people aren't, you know, necessarily available the weekend, but UUP was. And at the time, you know, and I will shout out to UUP was a different chief, but once everything was settled and everyone was safe, the chief actually sat down to me. It was actually Chief Rossi, Lieutenant Rossi, and he sat down with me and explained step by step what they did after we told them and everything they did to try and locate the student. And and make sure people were safe. And they were on it. And, you know, they're not, while it happens, I will tell if faculty get frustrated, you're not entitled to know every strategic move of the university police while it's happening. But they were actually, afterwards, they told me, and I realized, and a weekend where I was sort of in the dark and worried, they were on it. And they were on protecting the campus and really seeing after the welfare of the student as well. So.
And the systems are watching, right? Like we've had reports come in from more than just our campus entity to say, hey, we have a concern, here's a flag. And then we follow through on that, or they support us in following through on that. So it's not just our local campus team. There's bigger teams at play sometimes if there's things that are out there that are concerning.
Yeah.
We are part of that system. I think I've attended probably 6 or 7 like behavioral threat assessment management meetings with like fire departments from around the state, right? Like it's a bigger system than just our campus community, because we all have to work together in these scary times.
And I think your point, Grace, is really important to why, like, you are not facing any of this alone, right? Like, and, you know, yeah, you can't always get to know everything, but it also helps other people if you are documenting, if you are bringing people into the conversation, because yeah, they might be honestly fine. You know, sometimes I have it the other way around. I'll hear like, oh, this advisee is really struggling in this thing. I was like, well, that's odd because everything seems fine with me and them and, you know, the experiences I have. But the more that we have that, and there's things that like, you know, I have definitely gotten back some like kind of vague, like, yep, we're aware of some things happening, and you go, okay, cool. And to me, right, that's some good reassurance.
When you mention the name and there's a pregnant pause.
Yeah, we are aware, and you go, okay, all right, at least you're, you know, and it's, you know, do I want to know more often? I'm just like, oh, thank God someone else is aware. I don't want to be burdened with carrying this much information in my brain.
Right. And in terms of Reese, you said your chair, your dean, you might be in a situation where you don't feel you can come to the chair.
Right.
Right. And apparently, you know, not all cultures and all departments are equally supportive. I'm just going to say that. I'm just going to leave that there. Take it any way you want. So maybe you don't want to go to a chair or someone in your department because maybe you think it's, you know, you're concerned, what is this going to reflect on me for personnel, or it's just the environment's already very unpleasant and I don't want to do it. And so there are other resources. You know, I'm always happy to volunteer John, who's not here. But anyway, but SELF can actually give you connection. So because John knows, you know, teachers that are expertise in certain things that have dealt with certain things, and he can use that knowledge to try and make an informal connection. But, you know, I currently serve as vice president of academics in UUP. And so this is about your work environment, workload, potentially in the extreme cases, safety. And so, you know, you can also come to me first. And so UUP has no control over student conduct, but we actually do know, you know, the process of which, you know, sort of protects you, gets you resources, particularly for safety issues. And we can go from there. So not everyone feels like within their academic unit that they have someone that they can come talk to, but you know.
Yeah. And I think to add to that too, right, as this like kind of hints implied, is we have some really good resources that are more on the student affairs dean student side. Like they have the green folder, they have this. And that's also why, right, you as faculty, right, we're, you know, able to recognize, you know, policy and governance is an issue here, but like, that's not going to be in a moment. Like, you know, consulting a policy, even when we make one, right? Like, please do not go and say, pause. I have to read policy to figure out what I can do. But part of that faculty thing is being able to network. So you have other people, right? Someone from, you know, even a different social science that can be like, hey, I also have to talk about, you know, Durkheim's reading. Here's how I do it. Or, you know, when we think about something more humanistic and, you know, having Pat Clark and languages and, you know, English. Okay, well, I'm also talking about that reading in this perspective, or I'm talking about similar readings and figuring out, you know, who else can you talk to that might connect, but also who is different from you, right? If you're only going to talk to people that might respond like you, right? Or their strategies or their communication styles like you might limit your own ability to kind of brainstorm and connect because someone else might see it in a different way. And talking to that faculty member that teaches different style class, some econ, where my students are like, if you mention the word econ, they break out in hives. Right?
It's a very rational group.
Yes.
It is a rational group. Other disciplines, yeah. Well, other disciplines are like, man, There's some self-selection that goes on there, I'm just gonna say.
Yeah, so I think in there, that's one thing that like, as we're trying to compile, the parts that kind of get off the like slides are gonna be where you build your network, right? You connect informally and having these sorts of conversations, right? Popping down the hall to your friends that are with you in Morano Campus Center or everywhere else and being like, hey, have you ever had a problem like this, right? We need to kind of have some of those informal opportunities as well to build out that like connection. So ask any of us, ask John Kane, ask others.
Maybe even classroom management workshops and still,
Yep.
like, we could have difficult conversation workshops.
Yes.
If it's a habit we could start.
Yep.
So.
And, we are kind of in that last, we're now at 8 minutes left, which is about perfect for, what we only have here is like, again, I told Pat I'd send out the slides. That's totally true. Right now, truly right now, as in they got started is, we do have an ad hoc committee that's developing faculty guidelines for disruptive students, right? Even paying attention to the chat, things have come up here, the word recourse from Laura Donnelly's contribution, right? We want to make sure our policy makes sense for us. So, Brockport has a policy. If you ever want to consult theirs, New Paltz has a policy. Oswego is going to look at theirs, and kind of figure out what works for us. And can be something that is there to help. So again, if you have questions specifically, or you're like, I want a policy that has this, feel free to pass it to Gwen or me from here, right? And share things. And then, when I send out the slides, again, this kind of points to where we left off too, recognizing different campuses, different experiences, different law enforcement. Like we cannot speak to all of that, but tons of other schools have their own policies. They have things, some of theirs are like disruption is swearing, and I would not be able to have that be in my class. Sure, go ahead and say that word. I'm not going to say it. But in here, what we really have time in the last 6 minutes is any sort of other questions, comments, concerns, examples, feedback, thoughts that have just been on your own mind that you want to share with us. Is there anything that you want to contribute? Tell us. Drop in the chat, unmute yourself. Well, we solved all the problems.
We
That's
did.
it. Everyone now knows what everyone's encountered. They're like, or
Accomplished.
yes, let's get a banner.
Yeah, no, let's go with our banner. Going on Zazzle, get us a banner.
Or they're like, oh, thank God it wasn't just me. I think sometimes talking about this is reassuring where you're like, oh, I thought only I encountered this. I thought I was the only one. JR does say it's empowering to know there are expanding resources, best practices for stepping back into, stepping back into the classroom. Yeah, well said. And we've all been there, right? So even Grace was talking about some experiences, right?
Yeah.
When we're, we've all taught, we've all encountered in different subject areas, difficult situations. So if we're encountering them, you are too. And, we don't have all the answers. We just have a wide variety of experiences from different perspectives. And we hope that that's what you got out of this, that we have a good faculty group here and staff group that cares about students and cares about you too. And we want to make sure that's part of it.
Thank you.
All right, thank you guys for stopping in.
All right, well, in 5 minutes early. Cool.
I know.
All right, Florencia says, thank you. Thank you. Michael Chanas, yes. Well, resources and thank you. All right, cool. Thank you all. I'll stop sharing. I will hit stop recording for you. And